Thank you, Herman, for this specially designed fanfare for the Swedish General Pension, which celebrates its 100 years anniversary this very year. Ladies and gentlemen, heartily welcome to Stockholm and the beautiful island of Stora Essingen to help us to partake not only in the celebration of the Swedish General Pension, but to discuss security systems' role for the challenge of conquering poverty and to make a better future for the world. My name is Ulrika Knutson. I'm a journalist and I am your chair these days. Some of the seminars here are held in Swedish and will be translated. So dear English-speaking guests, I hope you have received earphones. If you have not, these are available in the reception. If you have your earphones ready, you must connect them to the receiver device, and volume can be adjusted on the side. If you feel like twittering, the Twitter address is #pension100, and the same address is also for Instagram. Alltså Twitter-adressen #pension100. And if you're not all Twitterers, and maybe you are curious how to Twitter, then we provide a Twitter school. So you're welcome back to join the Twitter school at 1 o'clock outside the plenary room. The tables where you brought your conference material may be used for placing information and leaflets if you want to share with others. That will be I will come back later with more information concerning lunch and everything. This conference would not be possible were it not for a number of distinguished partners. And among them are Help Age International, an organization which has strongly contributed in putting social security and old people's conditions on the international agenda. And a relatively young Swedish relative of Help Age is Pensioners Without Borders or Without Frontiers, PRO Global, who is among the organizers. Another partner is the Nordic Africa Institute, a well-known partner to Church of Sweden in, for example, a recent book project, the anthology Pengar I handen, Cash in Hands. The conference is also supported by Forskningsrådet FAS, who changed names this very July into FORTE. Sounds reliable, FORTE, Swedish Research Council for Health, Working Life and Welfare. We have also support from CSA, that is National Association of Social Work, an old organization who actually took initiative to the big conference on poverty and insurance in 1906. And we will come back to that conference later. Other partners are SIDA and SOFI, Swedish Institute for Social Research at the University of Stockholm. We hope that this conference will create more necessary links between welfare studies and development research. Positively, these disciplines have very much in common and could benefit from more cooperation. Now, we're all looking forward to inspiring meetings for 2 days here in Stockholm, and I thereby introduce our first speaker. Welcome.
Thank you.
Eva Brunne, Bishop of Stockholm. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Minister of Social Security, ambassadors, delegates who have been traveling for many hours to come here, and delegates who travel by bus for 15 minutes to come here. Welcome to Stockholm, and it's an honor for me to say that. And welcome to the conference on social pensions and the challenge of global poverty. It's not a conference on memories, but a conference towards future, with the history pushing us forwards. I'm very happy that this conference starts on the International Day of Elders, the 1st of October. And this day is also the 100th anniversary of the system of general pension in Sweden. First in the world, as I understand it, and for everyone from the beginning. Not only for those who had payment from former labor market, but also for them who worked in the informal economy in agriculture. Everyone got economical assistance in their old age. In the beginning, the pension was very low and not at all to guarantee what people needed to survive. But it was an important step on the way towards a welfare state. And it was a crossroad for the construction of social and economic security. Over the last years, social protection is a way of reducing poverty and hunger. This has been a very important issue on the agenda of global development. And experiences, not at least from Latin America, but also from Africa and Asia, shows that social transfers, money in the hand, cash in the hand, could have amazing results. Undernourishment decreases, especially among children. Children's possibility to affect education increases. Health improves, and that also creates conditions for a long-term economic development. Social pension is a central part of the protection system. We are here to learn about this development, but the aim of this conference is not only to take part in an important international discussion, but also to reflect the experiences from Sweden and the choices of the past centuries' development of welfare. In what way are we relevant for the countries that today are beginning to build up the social protection system? Social protection is not at all new for us in the churches and as Christians. Diakonia, Ministry of Care of the Poor, has always been important for us. But I have to say that sometimes it has been more about charity than of human rights. But diakonia is the essence of the gospel. God created us in his own image. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For all, you are all one in Christ. Therefore, it's our duty as human beings and Christians to take care of our sisters and brothers, young and old, poor and rich, not dependent on religious background or any ethnic status. The aim and goal of diakonia is to empower. My motto as a bishop is, do no respecter of persons. Church of Sweden International work is more and more based upon civil rights, based in our Christian identity and belief, of course. It's based on upon civil rights to increase people's capacity of claiming their rights, to educate and inform about human rights, to assist people in their contacts with authorities. It's also about building public opinion and looking with sharp eyes on authorities. This kind of work is different from the traditional role of giving assistance to concrete development projects and giving financial report to schools and medical care. It's about empowering. In working through a right-based approach, it's impossible not to engage in development of social protection system. It's an instrument of gaining human rights, the right to food, education, health, etc. Access to social security is a human right in its own. The social protection system is not without challenges in our country. We have a lot more to do and work with in relation to poor citizens from the European Union and in relation to refugees seeking freedom in our country. It's a responsibility for the state to build and take actions in the social protection system. No one else can do it in a long-term base. The role of the NGOs is to put pressure on the state and the governments, monitor implementation with sharp eyes, and assist people who are for different reasons are excluded. Through the history of Sweden, we can see how popular movements, churches, religious organizations, trade unions have had a very active part in the ongoing welfare system. Therefore, we are happy to arrange this conference with a number of organizations and institutions. The world is not easily and any longer to divide into poor and rich countries, but of course there are poor and rich countries, and there definitely are poor and rich people. We are here to learn, but most of all to share experience and work for a world that is for everyone. Once again, a warm welcome to a beautiful Stockholm, to Sweden, and to this important conference. God bless you and our days in the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Eva Brunne. And now we proudly present this morning's keynote speaker, a familiar name and face to Swedish friends, Professor Thandika Mkandawire from London School of Economics. And Professor Mkandawire has earlier upheld the special Olof Palme professorship here in Stockholm, and also worked with the African Institute of Uppsala. So please, Mr. Mkandawire, the floor is yours. Welcome. You take your time. And do you want me to give you a cough?
Yeah, 5 minutes before I get there.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the introduction. The minister, the bishop, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues, I'm deeply honored by this invitation to a conference on 100 years of social pensions in Sweden.
Excuse me. We must put this on.
Which one?
This. It's not on.
It's on.
Is it? Is it really?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
I'll speak louder. And to talk about a very extensive topic, the letter of invitation to me gave me an incredible agenda, which was to give a broad view of how the issue of social protection has emerged on the global agenda. But it also said, which I found much more interesting, you may also want to say whatever you want. No, he said you may want to link your own experience with living in Sweden and see how, and in this discussion about welfare systems worldwide. And I will do a little bit of that, not because it's not for biographical reasons, but I think because it makes sense in terms of what I'll be arguing about. One way of understanding social policy, somebody suggested, is to think of what we call the 6 I's. One is initial conditions of a country, ideas, interests, institutions, industrialization, and international order. So normally I would have spoken about all of these. I only concentrate on 2 of these, which is ideas and international order. Ideas matter a lot about social policy, and by ideas I mean not only sort of purely academic knowledge type ideas, but also ideologies, and as the Bishop reminded us, beliefs, views of society and of fellow human beings. And there's always a danger when you discuss social policies in a technocratic environment to ignore these ideas. And I think it's impossible to understand the nature of Swedish social policy over the century without understanding the great ideological battles that took place in these countries and that shaped what became the Nordic model. And I said it's very tempting to extract the technical part of it because it looks very neat, but I think once you do that, you will miss a lot of that. And in many countries who have tried some kind of social welfare, social protection regime, there have been all kinds of reasons argued in terms of ideas. Some have wanted to have argued in terms of nation building. It was very common in Africa in the 60s and 70s to argue for social policy in the name of nation building. Others have argued for self-sufficiency because the country wants to be somehow self-sufficient and therefore social protection is an important part of the story. Others have argued for socialism, others solidarity. So there have been different arguments for having kind of a welfare regime that countries have. And of course, if you're thinking about the global order, and I'll be saying, I won't go back as far as 100 years, but just think of what has happened in the post-Second World War period. And briefly, one of the first things that were very important, of course, in the post-World War is the two ideologies, if you like, 2 concerns that were prevalent in the world about economic development and about the welfare regime in the North. In the South was development, and the North was mostly about welfare regimes. And in one part of the world, you could argue that the Keynesian thinking about the welfare, about the economy and welfare was dominant, whereas in the other parts of the world was ideas about catching up and development were important. Strikingly, looking back, you would think that Nordic countries have been, I think they've been probably the most successful late industrializer in terms of catching up. Because we shouldn't forget that Sweden was once upon a time a developing country, or one of the least developed countries in Europe. And so it was, to me, it was an interesting story when I came to Sweden first time, to think of Sweden as a developing country, partly because I had been influenced by the reading of Gunnar Myrdal. Gunnar Myrdal kept on insisting in his work on developing countries about social policy as a social investment on the poor. And before I came to Stockholm, I had already read Gunnar Myrdal in development studies, and so when I came here, I ended up in Sweden by a long story, but that's another story. I ended up being a refugee here. But one of the things that I found attractive, that I was going to be going to the University of Stockholm, where Gunnar Myrdal was professor, and therefore I would be learning from this wise man about development studies. Unfortunately, he was not teaching anymore. And in fact, what was happening in my department was that there was at that time, what was an obvious attempt to dismantle whatever Myrdal had thought about development studies. So I never had the chance to study Gunnar Myrdal, nor did any of the courses I remember have any book by Gunnar Myrdal at the time. So that was, in a sense, let's say, a lost opportunity. However, I ran into a group of young ladies who were studying at something called SOPIS at that time. It was something about social policy place. And they were reading economics, and they were having trouble with economics, so I asked me to help them, to give them extra lectures. So I did that, and in the process, I got interested in knowing what they were reading. I mean, that is, what was this thing called social something they were reading, which was not part of my intellectual upbringing. So I got interested in their literature about what was welfare state, and that kept me thinking about that, about what was this thing called welfare state. I didn't, and I kept on from time to time sort of reading in and out about the experiences of the Swedish welfare state, and in many ways, at that time this was the 60s and 70s, or 70s mostly. It was impossible to avoid knowing something about the debate about welfare state. For instance, one of the things which was remarkable was that annually the Minister of Finance, Gunnar Sträng, would give after the budget, would give the budget speech at Handelshögskolan to explain what was the budget about. And the budget was always very clearly about social story. It was about how much money would be raised, what would be the productivity of the economy, what would be the tax regime to finance how much houses, how much child care, how much. It was very clear when you heard when speak that there was a budget, it was to raise money to finance this thing called the welfare state, and that again is a language you don't hear anymore. Nowadays, when you listen to, at least in our countries nowadays, when the minister talks about the budget, is about its impact on inflation, on balance of payments, and they don't mention these very concrete things that were. So anyway, the idea stuck in my head. I had no opportunity, unfortunately, to do any work on it until, by luck, I got a job in Geneva at UNRIST, which was the United Nations Social Research Institute for Development, which works on development issues, which was founded on the basis of ideas by Gunnar Myrdal and Jan Tinbergen, both who got Nobel Prize, but they were the drivers, the intellectual drivers behind the setting up of this UN institute, which would look at social development as opposed to what was called economic development. So I had this opportunity to lead this institute, and I persuaded my board that this should be our main research agenda, and managed to get a clearance from the board, and managed to raise some initial money to hold a conference here in Sweden to launch the research program and to have a discussion about what would it mean. And by that time, I had support from the Palme Institute, and Carl Tam was very, very instrumental in helping us organize this conference. The idea was actually to reflect what would be a research issue on this look like. So we began with we got some funding from Sweden later on, and other countries joined us, and so it became the flagship of our institute, the research agenda. It was a vast research program involving hundreds of scholars from all over the world, and the idea was to explore what is the role of social policy for countries which are developing. Okay? That was the question we wanted to answer. And we would answer that by looking at some experiences, including those of the Nordic countries, where we had actually a research network headed by Joakim Palme and Ulrika who were somewhere in this place. And then we had other studies from different parts of the world on what was the experience of social policy in developing countries. And but groups on Africa, which was led by Jimmy Adesina was here, and we had a group on Asia, and so forth. Anyway, we drew some important lessons, and in 3 minutes, I can give you all the lessons. There were about 11 books, nothing than that, but they have gone up to about 15, 20 books on the subject, and lots of papers were published. we learned a lot of things about it, and one thing I think I'd like to perhaps to stress when we discuss about pensions is that social policy had at least 4 things it worried about. One was protection, which is the pension story. The other one was distribution. The third was reproduction, which is family politics and so forth. And the fourth, which we often forget, was production. Okay, that social policy also had a role in production. And I think that is, to me, is the most important lesson from the Nordic experience. That there was an attempt to make sure that these 4 played a role in the discussion about social policy. Okay. In many countries, people pick up one thing, one of these, okay? You pick up one and ignore the other stuff. Usually if you do that, you run into trouble. Okay? For instance, if you only have distribution, which sometimes populist governments do, you distribute wealth and 4 years from now you're broke, okay? Because there's been no attempt to make sure that production was going on and so forth. Or if you focus only on production and you have a big success, you can end up like Tunisia. Things just blow up when there are social issues unaddressed. And so you have to worry about all these four things. And I hope that when people now say that they're looking at the Swedish model, they must not extract the pension from this dynamic of interrelationship. It's extremely important to bear in mind that you have to worry about all the 4. If you don't, you get into trouble. I think that's one of the lessons that came out from our... and there are examples of countries which have done one of these, okay? And then got into trouble because they didn't exploit the synergies of the various parts of the system. And we also learned from the Nordic experience that social policy is not something you do at the end of development, where you wait until when you have developed, then you have the welfare state. The usual view is that kind of the welfare policies are a luxury for rich countries, that you have to be very rich to get something done. And many countries in Africa, if you say, why aren't you doing this? They say, oh, we can't afford it. I think the Nordic country suggests very differently. In fact, the pension system in Sweden, introduced 100 years ago, was introduced at a level of development has been reached by many countries today in the third world. A country like Brazil, South Africa had much higher per capita income than Sweden had when they introduced their pension system. So it's not something you do at the end of the development process. And I think this is really a lesson to stress over and over again, that in fact, not only is it not something you do at the end, but that it is also a very important means for development. Especially this is a very important message for ministers of finance. For the ministers of finance, they see social policy as a cost, and they want to cut it. Okay? But I think what Gunnar Myrdal was saying about the social investment story was that it was also an instrument for development, and in many ways, it not only in terms of producing human capital through education and health, but some of the biggest savings you can collect as pensions. I think some of the studies by Pelle Kangas, for instance, was showing us that in Finland, pensions were very important for industrializing the country, for building infrastructure and all that. So while you're doing, and if you take for Africa, if you introduce a pension scheme today in Africa, which involves some kind of a contribution by young people, Africa is so young that they won't touch the money until 40 years from now. Okay? And so it can be huge amounts of savings can be generated through pension systems. So the pension systems have got many dimensions. There's protection, they're also for production, they are also for, they affect family politics, they also affect how incomes are distributed. But I want to stress that to keep in mind also that this social policy has a transformative role. It's not simply a static thing that you do to get people happy. And that's why in many ways in the debates internationally where you get a collision between social policy discourse and other discourses on development, is that sometimes they're seen as fighting each other as separate. So the Minister of Finance wants to cut because it's too costly, because they don't see it as a transformative tool. We also learned from the Swedish experience that, and this is where Sweden also Swedish experience is very complicated. It's that this was one of the last industrializers which was also a democracy which had a social policy and therefore at the same time was growing fairly rapidly. It's very difficult to find so-called developmental states that are democratic. Most of the developmental states today, when we talk about Korea, Taiwan, are authoritarian. So one of the things that I found fascinating about the Nordic experience was precisely that, suggesting that you can actually develop very rapidly and be fairly democratic and be fairly inclusive. So we don't have to look at the fascist model as the solution for developing countries. And that required a very complex process of social pacts and social agreements, which are a very important part, of the Nordic story. It is not a technocratic story. It's a story of struggle, of pacts, agreements, and strikes, and darling, and all that. It's part of the story of Sweden. It's a much more complex story of social pacts. The other very important lesson we learned from Sweden, which was also stressed by the bishop, was the tendency towards universalistic policies. In today's global discourse about social policy, the tendency is for targeting the poor. That you have programs that target the poor, and it sounds very nice when targeting the poor. It sounds like, but one of the things that you learn from the Swedish experience, and I think other Nordic countries, that the more successful policies against poverty did not address poverty. They were doing many other things. They were protecting people. They were bringing people in society. They were inclusive, and the language was about inclusion, about equality, about safety and all that, and that those are what helped fight poverty. And I think it's very important to bear that message in mind, because generally, this is a very sweeping statement, for which I cannot defend myself. Generally, poor policies are poor policies, right? They are poor for two reasons. One, they're poorly funded, usually very poorly funded, because they leave out the middle class. The middle class is where the fundraisers are left out. Okay? And two, they are marginal. They're often marginal. Even the most progressive policies that we're seeing now in Latin America, whether it's progress and all that, they are marginal to the social policy of at large. And I think the lessons in Sweden has been that social policy must be at the core of policy in general. It cannot be something very marginal that you do almost on weekends. And I think that's another important lesson, that poverty is fought best not by addressing quotation like poverty, but by doing all kinds of things. Some of them, which somebody told me once that there was an attempt to look at whether in Finland, from the 30s on, whether in the literature of policy there was ever mention of the word poverty, and someone said there was hardly any mention of poverty in their policies, but somehow it worked out. And normally, the more you hear a country talk about poverty, the less it does about it, right? So you hear more about poverty in Britain than you hear about poverty, in Germany, because I think that's the nature of poverty discourse. So I think that it was just again, it's an important Swedish lesson. Another lesson we learned from Sweden was the importance of state capacity, and that you cannot have an effective social protection when the state is weakened, which is the contradiction of the debate today about social protection. Institutions which have been dismantling the state in the developing countries are now saying the state should take on the task of social protection. Social protection, I learned this in Sweden, is very demanding, not only in terms of capacity, it's demanding fiscally. I thought when Gunnar Myrdal's speeches was always about how to finance the social welfare state. I mean, the welfare state is demanding in terms of financing, and that's an important part of it. So when you have policies that on one hand are dismantling the state, or are weakening the fiscal capacity of the state, to then say that state must assume social protection is a contradiction in terms, I think. I think that's the lesson we come from here. But if this is true about Last point about Nordic countries, of course, is that there's a variety of Nordic social policies, that there's no such, there are, what I've given you a very general statement, but that each country has to find its own model to do that. Now, the question is, why has this good story been invisible in policies? And that became another obsession I had when I was in Geneva. Why is the Nordic model not visible? Okay. Some say because Nordic people are very modest, and therefore they don't want to go around preaching to the world that we have a good thing, and that may be true. But I think some of it is partly what I said earlier on, the belief that the welfare state is an end state. It's something you end at, and therefore for poor countries it's not affordable. So you see, people say, well, it's an interesting story, but you wait for 50 years, you get there. That has been the so-called affordability argument. The other argument has been the view that, kind of a linear view, that there are stages, you follow stages, and you wait your turn. That I think is not it's a misleading argument, and I'm not going to go through it in detail. The second has been, I think also the Nordic countries themselves, when they transferred the model into public discussions outside the world, they only took parts of the story. Okay? So it looked like a welfarist argument. Okay? It was not the welfare as we understand it in its complexities. People saw of Sweden only the welfarist side. They didn't see the taxation side, the production side, the labor market side. There was this much more complex system behind the Swedish model. So it was seen as something which just helps people. But that's not where I understand the Swedish model. It was much more complex than that. And I think because of that, it gave this misreading that therefore it's too, you can't afford it because you don't think of it as a transformative tool for development or for social change. The third was, there was a very strong belief that there's a trade-off, between equality and economic development. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, has called this what's called the blast model. The blast means blood, sweat, and tears. That development is blood, sweat, and tears. You have to sweat first, and then one day you'll get development. And therefore, you don't include this. And finally, of course, there was a very difficult, especially in more recent years, the neoliberal attack on the Nordic model has spilled over into international debate. People say, well, why do you like this thing? The Nordics themselves are tired of it. Why are you talking about something which the Nordics themselves are giving up? But I think that overall, I think there's a lot of interest in the Nordic experience here, and I think we have to bring it back to the international debate, and I think in many ways, one could argue that this is probably the perfect time for discussing the Nordic lessons or the Swedish lessons for the other countries. One is that the neoliberal model is in crisis. There's been massive social dislocation, growing inequality, huge urbanization in Africa with no protection at all. People moving into cities, they have lost their traditional forms of protection, and they're in a new environment where this doesn't exist. So there's an interest in that. Secondly, I think the growing movements for democratization are pushing for a social agenda that, and we've seen it much more in Latin America, that is asking for the issues of equity, social protection to be brought back. And that kind of these domestic pressures to bring those ideas back on the agenda, I think would make the Nordic, at least the Nordic experience much more interesting and much more perhaps easier to receive nowadays if it is presented in its complex structure. I therefore believe that in celebrating these 100th years of the Swedish pension, we shouldn't see it as celebrating an end of a story, but see it as starting a new debate on how to proceed. And I think that Nordic countries, especially Sweden has been very important in debates about social policy historically in the international organization. Many minutes? Very good. And in virtually, huge amounts of research, in the United Nations, for instance, on whether it's on employment, on gender, on equity, has been financed by Sweden. So Sweden has a leverage politically to begin to affect the intellectual debate. I think what Sweden didn't often was to give money and not push the intellectual debate. I think that we ought to do more of that. And there are many ways of doing that. One, which has not been done by Sweden, is that there's a huge number of researchers in Sweden who work on social policy and social welfare regimes, from history to contemporary problems. They have never been brought into development debates, because there's a split word in Sweden about u-landsforskning and in something else. Okay, and I think it's incredible, because that would mean that 90% of your universities, which are not working on u-lands problem, are left out of your 1% engagement in a country. It's very strange. If you think about it, you're spending 1% of your GDP in developing countries, and somehow you keep your universities, only one small part of it is engaged in that. I think you should find ways of, especially with respect to the subject of social policy, where you obviously have an advantage of a huge history of research on the subject here. And secondly, Sweden has, as I said, because of its engagement with the international world in particular, has supported and nourished a large number of networks on research in developing countries and within the UN. I think you enjoy an advantage there, an enormous advantage of goodwill and trust over many years of supporting these networks. And I would urge Sweden to engage, to support these networks, to do more work, and to have a better understanding, if they're going to learn from the lessons of countries like these countries, on how things have worked, and to allow an engagement with the scholars here and scholars from the developing country. I am, naturally, as a researcher, I value that, not because I think it's the only thing to be done, but I think that it's something that this country is very well placed to engage in. There will be, from the discussions, looking at the program here, all these issues I've talked about briefly will be discussed, I'm sure, in details and in much better form than I have. But I wanted just to highlight the fact that the lessons of these countries, the historical lessons of these countries, are very important, not only for Sweden, but can also be adjusted and be debated and be opened up to other countries. There's a lot of interest. The people who have been involved in this onerous network who are here, Ole Kangas and Joakim, will probably testify that they've had lots of invitations by people who want to know more about this story about social policy and social development. And I can't imagine a better way of doing it by having scholars from the other parts of the world coming here and policymakers from other parts of the world engaging those people who have been doing this for the last 100 years. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Thandika. Since you are you have such excellent timing, please be seated.
Oh, okay.
We have a few minutes left for questions too, which is wonderful after this inspiring and really thought-provoking speech. There are so many issues that we can nourish from during the whole conference. And before I ask for questions from the floor, of course you were so focused.
I didn't have to say anything more.
Oh, I'm sorry. There are lots of things
To think about. Thank you very much for that, Eva. And that goes for every one of you. Don't hesitate to correct me or say things. If I get things wrong. You focused, of course, on the Nordic model and the role it plays, could play, or hesitates to play. And you put it like this: why is the Nordic model not more visible? And of all the levels you mentioned, which would you say is the most important in this field? If you could prick us in the back with a needle, what do you think Swedish politicians and researchers should deal with first to get out more visibly on the international arena with the model?
One thing they shouldn't do, they should not do what they're doing now. That's not right. That is, they should not be pulling out of the. There has been, as I said, Sweden has been engaged in many ways in international arena in terms of supporting. It's not. I don't think it's been engaged fully intellectually in terms of to actually understand the nature of Swedish. Listening on. So I would just say that you must provide more facilities for.
I can move it a little here.
Oh, it's up here. My God.
And do you know why?
No, it's upside down.
It's upside down.
So one of the things my student must do is to get my microphone correct. I'm getting over here.
It's these things are lovely because they look like glasses, but they hang on your ears.
Ah, okay.
And you're beautiful. I'm sorry to meddle with your beautiful ears, but I'll do. Right. This is.
Very good.
You have to have an exam from the MIT to get it right. I'm so sorry. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I honestly don't know how to prioritize these things. I think, one is to, if I may use my prejudice as a researcher, is to provide space for researchers from here to engage with researchers from there, like from other parts of it, and have more possibilities of influence and debate, intellectual debates going on in the UN. The UN, of course, is very broad, but it has a very powerful convening authority, the UN. I mean, I was running a very small institute, but I could convene huge numbers of people. I mean, that's why so it's not, when people ask what's the effect of the UN, it's very misleading, because it's not so much that something you can measure, it's the capacity to convene these discussions. And I think if I were a Swedish diplomat, I would say that's an extremely important part to play for a small country, because you are leveraging your own networks. You have, as I said, Sweden has a huge contacts with the rest of the world that it can leverage to have debates about what things we're talking about here. So I would say that's probably the most, create these platforms for exchange of ideas, not only by researchers, but by the various actors who have thought about these issues, whether it's the church or the unions. They've all thought about welfare regime. How do they engage their counterparts elsewhere in debating what was their own experience about the Nordic experience and how does it apply to their own?
What would you say in the global problems which we are all facing? What's the greatest, most great challenge towards building systems of social protection?
The lessons from the Second World War, the post-Second World War era, somebody called it, was called embedded liberalism, which meant that individual states were given lots of space for policy. I think the most important thing today is create space for individual states to think about social policies. What has happened in the last 30 years is to restrict countries from thinking about social policies, because we're all being pushed towards one model, the model of a weak state and a weakened market. So for most new democracies, especially, the great thing you can do to them is to give them more policy space, if you like. That the global, I know there are all these global agenda, MDGs and all that, they're important, as normatively. But implementation ultimately is at the state level. And if states are handicapped in terms of they cannot talk about, they cannot experiment, then it won't work. And I think one of the Nordic lessons was that, especially in the post-Second World War era, this was an era where states were allowed more space for policies. I recall in Sweden, when the debate about joining the euro or not, one of the elements was whether, in fact, it would limit the space for Sweden to pursue social policies. So I think this idea of creating space for states to experiment and learn and from others, that should be an important global argument. And historically, Sweden was very famous for its neutrality and used that to argue for space for new countries to have more space to think. And the lessons, like I said, countries shape this thing themselves. And even within Nordic countries, there are very big differences in the welfare regime. So you have to have space to do that. And the international order now is at least trying to reduce space for countries to think about their social policies.
Thank you, Thandika. Thank you very much. And I got my strict orders from our dictator here at ringside, Gunnel Axelsson Nykander. So please, a big hand for Professor Thandika Mkandawire.